The conquest did not have to happen this way. Night lies over the lake like polished obsidian, a surface so dark the city appears to float. Thousands of lamps quivering along canals, rooftops, causeways that run like stone spears into the water. A drum speaks from the Templo Mayor, one measured heartbeat, then another, and the sound carries over reed beds and silent chinampa gardens until it reaches the watchman on the southern causeway, a man whose breath hangs in the cool air, whose hands rest on a paddle smooth as bone. You can feel him swallow. You know why. Far beyond the lamps of Tenochtitlan, at Veracruz, men of metal and horses have planted a wooden tooth in the shore, a pier to another world, and that tooth is aching to bite again. Listen, the lake breathes. Canoes tuck close to the walls, their crews whispering, skirting the glow where torchlight paints ladders on the water. The watchman's eyes flick to the causeway gate. Hinged beams, a chain of logs, a place where stone narrows and the city can decide who comes in and who does not. If you stand here long enough, you hear more than the drum. You hear a market's murmur, even at night, freighted with tomorrow. Cacao and salt and cotton, obsidian blades, fish brought in wet baskets. You hear mothers measuring grain by lamp, priests counting days, men in council weighing names. You hear a rumor tugging at the edges of the city. Smallpox, a fever that arrives before its own name, riding in the breath of strangers and the dust of blankets. You hear that the enemy is crafting boats of his own, brigantines, they say, ships that will be unbound by causeways and shall cut the lake like knives. If the water becomes a road for them, how long can the stone hold? Look toward the palace. Moctezuma's flower gardens lie shadowed, the scent of night-blooming cereus too sweet for a city keeping watch. Once he opened his hands to the strangers, then closed them, then opened again to the watchman on the causeway. That indecision is visible even now, even after Moctezuma's voice has been carried away by dust and grief. Cuitlawac's name rides the drumbeats instead, the warrior uncle who does not bow, whose eyes reflect torchlight as if it were something to be caught and thrown. Beside that name, another, quieter but sharper, Cuauhtémoc, the young eagle who speaks less and listens to the lake, as if it were a mouth whispering tactics. You try to stand where they stand. Veracruz is not merely a far-off beach. It is a wound with a wooden plug, and through that plug, supplies and letters seep, promises of gold drawing more steel from across the sea. Inland, Tlaxcala wears old scars from wars waged for tribute and captives. In this dusk, those scars are currency, a reason for Tlaxcalans to take iron hands when they are offered, to march beneath a banner they do not love simply because it points against the enemy they do. In the streets, the word Cholula moves like a flare in dry reed. The memory of that city's massacre is a mouthful of ash that even water will not wash away. And then Tóxcatl, music, dancing, and blood, the sudden red sky of betrayal in a festival that should have crowned the gods with flowers. Pedro de Alvarado's name is a thorn in every throat. The lake breathes again, and you with it. The watchman thinks of the aqueducts, Chapultepec's twin spines reaching toward the city, the lifelines that can be cut by hands brave enough to run and sharp enough to sever. He thinks of the causeways, straight-backed, studded with openings where bridges can be lifted, the city's ribs that could also become its snares. He thinks of Melincen's voice, smooth as water on stone, turning Nahuatl into Spanish, and Spanish into Nahuatl until treaties bloom and wither in the space between words. He wonders how many words it would take to stop a storm, and whether words alone can do such work. You stand at the lake edge and feel another heartbeat, this one in your wrists. You did not come here for a retelling of Iron Triumph. You came to ask a treasonous question. What if those lamps still burn at dawn? What if decisions taken on nights like this, on the water, not the plaza, tilt the lake so that attackers must climb it like a hill and slip back down armor first? What if the Empire forgets how to swagger and learns, for once, how to bend? If power is a reed, can it survive by bending farther than any wind expects? The drum stills for a moment. In the hush, a canoe noses out from shadow, its prow blackened with pitch. The men inside are not many and not loud. A priest in cotton steps back from the water and does not turn to the gods. Instead, he turns to the men with paddles and points toward the northern tree line, where the moon bottlenecks through leaves. No proclamation is made, no banner is lifted, but you feel the decision. The city will fight with water and time, with darkness and distance, with hunger and rumor, with the quiet agreements of markets and the noiseless removal of planks. Stay with me on this shoreline if you want to hear how a people might trade blood for patience and steel for silence, how a lake can become a merciful trap. Light a signal with us, subscribe to What If Wars, and keep to the canoe's wake. The lake knows the first names of everything that will matter: Veracruz, Tlaxcala, Cholula, Tóxcatl, La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, when armored men stumbled under treasure and fell into black water, pulled down by golden panic while obsidian snapped and paddles struck. It knows the second names too: aqueducts that can be blocked, bridges that can be lifted, channels that can be narrowed with stakes hidden beneath algae and night. It knows a word not spoken yet, but coming across timber and tar: brigantines. These boats will splice the lake, cut free of causeways, bring crossbows and fire pots where paddles used to hold the line. The lake hears them being built already in the mind's ear. Tonight, though, the city is louder. In the marketplace, lanterns doused, stalls shuttered, pochteca sit with abacuses of memory, counting who owes whom, which roads are safe, which towns will trade when the bells strike in warning. They are merchants, but in the dark, they become emissaries. They talk about Texcoco's pride and Tlatelolco's rivalry like two strands in a knot that must be tied and not cut. They know that tribute is a rope too. Pull too hard and it strangles, slacken too much and the bundle spills. They pass a shared gourd of chocolate and agree that trade can do what blades cannot: make yesterday's enemy tomorrow's ballast. At the palace, warriors are called but not to march. They gather around a basin where oil has stilled into a mirror. A hand scatters ash over the surface, and the reflection fractures. Not the plaza, someone says. The lake. The voice is not cruel. It is exact. They speak of guard posts like beads along the causeways, of gates that will open and close on signals carried by fire and drum. They lower their fingers through the oil and explain how a canoe's wake travels before the canoe itself. They talk about backing away in order to win, about making the Spaniard fight 100 small battles instead of one, about how a man with a horse becomes a man with a burden when the ground softens and the water catches his shadow. You can smell pitch, resin, the clean wet of freshly cut reeds. Outside the palace walls, men slide logs into water, then pull them back, listening to the sound the lake makes when wood kisses it. There will be caltrops of stakes in the shallows, carved and anchored to face the wrong way. Wrong, that is, for anyone charging forward. There will be pits dug into causeway earth and covered over with reeds, so they look like continuations instead of mouths. There will be bridges that lift not with the panic of ambush, but with the method of ritual, at a beat practiced until it enters the body like breath. Above this, the air carries sickness. Smallpox does not argue, it arrives. The city feels the heat of it on the edges of the skin. The fevers, the pustules, the breath that goes short. Nobody can stop the wind, but the wind can be forced to travel farther to find its next person. Canoes ferry baskets to island gardens instead of crowds pressing through narrow aisles. Water is stored in jars sealed with cloth soaked in herbs that smell of smoke and sage. Priests teach a prayer that is mostly spacing. Leave room at the temple steps. Leave room at the market gate. Leave room on the canal where once boats would bump and laugh. The drumbeat counts those spaces too. It is not salvation, it is delay. And delay is value enough when your city must stay smart longer than your enemy can stay supplied. The names again. Hernán Cortés, a man who writes letters to men you will never meet, promising rivers of gold and fields sown with the crosses of new churches. Pedro de Alvarado, a blade with a face, a festival turned to flash and screaming beneath his hands. Malintzin, a mouth that has learned to run in 2 languages at once, a bridge across which misunderstanding and opportunity travel like twin horses, and across the lake, perched in the sawdust light of makeshift carpentry, men who speak of keels and sails, who imagine tiny oceans inside a lake and dream of outrunning paddles with wind. The city shrinks that ocean. Canoes go out at dusk with sacks of stone and drop them where channels run deepest. Not enough to make a wall, enough to make an annoyance. Others drag logs behind them and leave them snagged in reeds that will not look like traps until a rudder catches and a shout rises. In a warehouse, timber goes missing not in planks but in splinters. An edge here, a wedge there, nails bent with quiet patience. On one night, a stack of canvas tarps darkens with an oil that makes them heavy and disinterested in wind. On another, a pump valve goes missing and nobody can say how. Meanwhile, the causeways gather their own teeth, hidden beneath shallow water, where men on horseback do not see until the horse sees first. This is not bravado. It is survival, lit by a softer fire. In a council chamber, a map of alliances is redrawn with the same care used to paint a mask. Tlaxcala is not a word to spit, but a hand to hold differently. A limited amnesty is spoken, low-voiced but firm. If you stand against the men of metal, you will pay less tribute than you did yesterday, and you will pay it in goods you can spare. No more will we demand captives from your ranks for the knives of the high platform. We will honor the gods with feathers and bread and breath, with blood taken from our own elbows under our own moons. In exchange, your markets will be protected by law, your roads kept clear of raiders bearing our badges, your leaders given benches in our council where they can argue and be argued with. The pochteca carry this message tucked under the words for price and path, and the message feels like a door that was once locked and now opens inward. From the causeway, the city looks invulnerable. From the lake, the city looks breakable. From the shore beyond the lake, sown with cactus and rock, the city looks impossible again. That is the truth of Tenochtitlan. It is not one place. It is at least three, and the trick is to be the right one to the right eyes at the right time. Tonight, the city is the place that refuses to be found in straight lines. It slides sideways under torches. It closes a bridge and opens another 2 canals down. It lets you chase a canoe that never seems to paddle and yet is always a finger's width beyond your reach. You are here for a different ending, and endings begin with listening. Listen to the small logistics. The granary that receives a little more maize than usual this week. The tax collector who skips a town not because he is lazy, but because a plague will be lighter there if crowds are smaller. Listen to a priest instructing a sculptor to carve a heart that is a flower instead of a flame. Listen to the mother who explains to her child that the gods drink from a different cup now, one that keeps more breath in the lungs of men who will carry shields tomorrow. Listen to a messenger whispering to a man who once fought on the wrong side. If you switch, the city will not write your name in the book of shame, but on a bench of the council, and your market will see weights and measures made honest. A wounded coast guarded by wooden teeth, inland allies recruited by grievances older than iron, a capital that learns to think in water, a sickness that cannot be stopped but can be slowed, and on the lake's edge, a decision to turn stone into trap and time into weapon. The city has chosen to bend. The question is whether bending can be a form of striking. Far away, across a sea you cannot picture because it refuses to end, a king will read letters and draw lines on a map that is wrong about almost everything. Near at hand, across the lake you can picture because it ends in your own reflection. Carpenters hammer by torch and whisper the names of their boats, as if naming can make a thing faster. The watchman hears the hammering, the way a deer hears a hunter think. He tightens his grip on the paddle and counts. Not enemies, beats. The city's heart. 1, 2, 3. On the 4th beat, a gate will lift. On the 5th, a canoe will pass. On the 6th, another will follow. On the 7th, torches will already be hidden, and the water will show nothing but stars again. You can choose to stand with him. You can set your feet on wet stone and feel how the causeway is colder than the lake. You can look out and let your eyes keep going until you see a reflection that is not yours. The shadow of a future where Spanish sails search the lake for a wind that is not there, and paddles decide when to be seen. That future has not happened. The carpenters have not finished their boats. Tlaxcala has not changed its mind. The councils have not replaced knives with flowers, but on a night like this, with a drum that speaks more clearly than any letter, with the smell of pitch and the sound of a single canoe cutting a silent line, you begin to understand that victory might be the art of running away at the exact right second and returning a breath before the enemy does. The lamps keep quivering. The drum begins again. A man lifts a bridge and slides a pin into place with a sound small enough to hide in a swallow's wing. Another smears pitch along a canoe's rim and keeps a flint tucked beside his tongue, the way another man might keep a prayer. Somewhere, Melinson stares into a courtyard where shadows make a chessboard and counts arguments nobody else hears. Somewhere else, a boy wakes with fever and a mother dampens his forehead and decides not to go to the temple in the morning. The city shortens its stride without breaking it. The water is teaching, and for once power is listening. The city has learned to bend. Now it must teach others how to bend with it. Morning combs the lake into silver threads, and the council hall opens its doors to a thin wind that smells of wet stone and roasted maize. Tlatelolco sits neither high nor low, but close enough to the doorway that he can hear the water. He has washed his hands in smoke and refuses to wash them in fear. His breath is steady, his eyes slow, as if taking too quick a look at anything might break it. At his shoulder, Cuauhtémoc leans forward, the way a hunter leans toward the earth to listen for hooves. The room is crowded and quiet. The map on the floor, marks for causeways, notches for guard posts, charcoal ripples for channels, waits like a game board that refuses to be played the same way twice. The first act is not a sword stroke. It is a sentence, an amnesty spoken so plainly that even enemies can remember it without needing a priest. Tribute terms roll back from a cliff edge toward a plain song. Tlaxcala, whose warriors have spent years feeding the altars, will not be asked to bleed to dress our gods. Their market gates will hold our seal, and our seal will mean what the seal of a conqueror rarely means: protection. A bench in council, not as a subjugated echo, but as a voice timed to the drum. We have spent too long hunting our own shadow, Tlatelolco says, each syllable harder than wood. If we must choose between the taste of pride and the taste of survival, today we eat. A pochteca named Xocoyotzin, who is bartered in Texcoco's market so often that he can smell false weights through a wall, bows once and carries the new law into the alleys. He is not alone. Merchants scatter like swallows at dusk, to Tlatelolco's stalls and beyond, to the valleys where cornfields gleam and where resentments have been hoarded the way other men hoard copper. Their satchels do not hold silver. They hold promises measured in tolls and exemptions and safe conduct tokens carved from bone. They drink thin chocolate with men who once cursed Tenochtitlan's name and let those men curse again, so long as their spears point toward Veracruz when they do. Why should we trust you? A Tlaxcalan elder asks in a courtyard where the morning has not yet warmed the stones. The pochteca does not speak of honor. He speaks of disease and ships. Because we can slow one and sink the other, he says. Because if the men of metal finish their boats, no hill will be high enough to keep you from their eyes. Because our lake is not just ours. If we use it well, it drenches both our enemies. The elder's mouth tightens as if it has bitten a bitter seed. His grandson watches from behind his legs with a wooden horse clutched to his chest, and the horse has no legs. He finally nods, the smallest gesture a man can make without calling it surrender. We will not send captives, he says. Not one. Not one, the merchant agrees, and Cuauhtémoc, who has come in plain cotton and without a retinue, watches the word not become the hinge on which an old door swings. The city has chosen to trade edges for bonds. If the bonds hold, power will travel farther than any sword. On the lake, words turn into lumber. Guard posts rise along the causeways like new teeth, low, functional, roofed against rain, their floors strewn with sand to keep footsteps quiet. Each post holds a water jar, a coil of rope, a horn, and a board that becomes a signal when lifted in the torchlight. The removable bridges are rebuilt not as ad hoc planks, but as engineered vertebrae, each with a pin the size of a wrist and a counterweight that lets 3 men lift what once took 10. The carpenters count heartbeats as they work. How many between a horn and a lifted span? How many between a lifted span and the first splash of armored men realizing their path has ended in water? A doctrine takes shape in the mouths of patrol leaders. The lake does not forgive certainty. Never be where you were a moment ago, they say. Never charge into light. Pull the light toward you and fight at its threshold. Obsidian-studded clubs are wrapped with leather at the grip so they do not slip when drenched. Shields are rimmed with rawhide, not for beauty, but to catch oars. Paddlers trained to count strokes in silence, to feel each other's movements through hulls. When they practice, boys line the wall to watch, their eyes taking in a language that will never be written, but could be recited body by body. 3 strokes quick, 1 long. The turn on the breath, not the shout. The press of the bow into reeds to still the wake. Across the water, men whittle timbers into keels beneath a canopy of canvas that flaps like a broken sail. If the brigantines become real, their draft will be shallow, their bellies carrying crossbowmen and arquebusiers whose weapons speak in smoke and suddenness. But crossbows need dry bowstrings, and powder needs dry nothing. Send rain, whisper the women scaffolding a ceremonial arch, and one of them laughs without mirth. Rain will come if it comes, she says. Men can also bring water. She means canoes, the ones that will carry skins to spill across decks, bags of sand to turn speed to sludge, thorned stakes meant to kiss oak in the dark. Fire canoes are assembled quietly, hulls smeared with pitch, bundles of reeds bound in oil, clay pots filled with kindling and set to break on impact. The men who will paddle these do not tell their wives what kind of death they court. They tell them to keep the children away from crowds for a while and to bury water jars up to the shoulder in cool earth. At the coastal plain, the Gulf breathes brine and heat and the promise of hurricanes that do not care what side a man is on. Scouts rotate in bands that know each inlet by the taste of its mud. They do not attempt to hold the beaches. That is not the lesson of this war. They watch, wait, and strike at the exact hours when a ship's belly is most exposed, during unloading and after the first rain has swelled the grain sacks. A cache burns, then another spoils. A barrel's iron hoops are found bent, as if a giant hand had tired of circles. The Spanish write letters that smell of frustration, telling of invisible thieves who take nails and leave sermons. A priest frets about souls, while a quartermaster frets about powder that clumps like porridge. Why does any of this matter? Because the invader's might is a column built of pieces that do not all arrive at once. Their letters took months to cross the sea. Their guns cannot shoot without powder. Their horses cannot gallop on water. Their boats cannot launch without timber. Their courage does not thrive on hunger. A slow enemy is a smaller enemy. A hungry enemy is a weaker enemy. A delayed enemy grows louder in his own skull than on the field. The Aztec have learned to make delay into a blade with no edge and yet many cuts. The lake doctrine deepens. A runner brings news that a channel near the northern reed beds is 15 paddles wide. By dusk, it is 9. Stakes pair it narrower still, their points angled slightly upstream so that any hull that catches must fight both wood and current to free itself. Canoes are drilled to vanish into beds at a signal, reeds pulled over them so that they assume the lake's own complexion. When a teacher asks a class of boys how many strokes it takes to disappear, 10 arms go up with 10 answers. It depends, their instructor says, and for once the word is not a dodge, it is policy. In the palace, a different doctrine takes shape, ritual without slaughter. The high priests do not give up blood, they reassign it. Instead of captives torn upon altars, warriors prick their own ears and tongues in dark chapels, leaving small stains that nobody outside will ever see. Feasts bloom with maize and amaranth, shaped into hearts that are broken with a priest's thumb and shared. The gods are not denied, they are negotiated with, as if even divinity understands that times change more easily than mountains. The people feel the difference without anyone naming it. Mothers breathe easier during festival days. Potential allies measure the distance between their disgust and their self-interest and find the gap suddenly crossable. Spanish powder dries slowly while patience hardens. Allies who once spat at our stone now spit over our shoulders, and the lake has learned to hide ambushes in its own reflections. Melinson stands at the edge of a patio and watches ants dismantle a beetle. She knows that words can be physics when they alter the direction of a blow. She has delivered messages that unmade cities. Now she carries one that does not wish to unmake, but to hold. When she translates the amnesty and the tribute reprieve to men who expect threats, her voice is flat and clear. No seduction, no apology. "We will not ask your sons for our altars," she says, and feels something unfamiliar in her mouth. Relief. Later at night, she listens to the lake's small noises and wonders how many bridges a person can be before they become a road. Messages travel back from the hills. Some are thin, like reeds, lukewarm acceptances couched in conditions. Some are thick as rope. Men bring baskets of salt to market under our seal and expect not to be robbed by our own patrols. "We will test you," one lord says, and he is right to try. Quitlawak sends a quiet order. Any patrolman taking what is not his will pay double in public, with corn or cloth according to what he stole. The first punishment is boring to watch and therefore memorable. It is not meant to satisfy wrath, but to lay a track that others will step on without thinking. When justice arrives as habit, a confederation is more than a word. On the causeways, the council's patience faces a different test. Spanish scouts ride to the margins with banners stitched in new color and call across the water for parley. A small boat ferries a captain in a breastplate that has seen better polish. He announces that his general will build boats on the lake and that the city should consider its future in the light of that certainty. "Your god walked on water," Cuauhtémoc says, "and ours walks under it." The captain laughs, then does not. He has seen what happens when a horse steps into a hole it did not know was there. "This is a warning," he says. "This is a reply." Cuauhtémoc answers and gestures behind him. Two men lift a bridge span with a serenity that looks rehearsed because it is. The channel beneath gapes, black and patient. The captain glances down, measures with his eyes, and performs a calculation that admits the existence of drowning. His boat retreats with more noise than it needs. A runner arrives, breathless, from the carpenter's yards. The brigantines are now more than rumor. Frames up, canvas measured, caulking begun. The city's reply has already been in motion for days. At twilight, along a reed-choked bank, men who smell of mud and resin slide a raft into a channel nobody uses because it is too narrow for pride. The raft carries bundles wrapped in wet leather. At a signal, two cranes croaking in succession. The bundles are tipped to float, and when they bump, a line stretched low across the channel, the leather breaks. Reeds inside spill out and lodge into a mat, then another mat, until what looks like refuse becomes a fence. Not a wall. Enough. The men sink the anchors that will hold the fence almost, but not quite, submerged. The trick is to hide the trap so well that its existence is remembered only by the men who built it, and then even they forget, trusting the lake to keep its secrets. In a courtyard cinched by white walls, a physician kneels by a child whose eyes shine with fever. He has no cure. He has water boiled and cooled with herbs, and he has a quiet rule he repeats to every mother. "Do not come to the market tomorrow. Send your husband alone. Keep the child in the shade. Change the cloth on his forehead when it dries. Pray if you must, but pray with open windows." The priest who once would have demanded a captive for the god now sits with the doctor and murmurs a chant that is more ache than command. Public health becomes a kind of liturgy. The city does not flaunt it. The city needs it to function more than it needs credit. Meanwhile, rain taps the coast. Powder clumps in a tent that leaks at one corner. A sentry dozes. A lantern flares. A crate of matches, kept dry for weeks, becomes briefly wet as a careless hand moves it from one table to another. At dawn, scouts find that rats have spent the night chewing through a coil of rope used to hoist barrels, and the hoisting stops while the rope is replaced. An hour's delay becomes 3. 3 becomes 6. A ship that meant to sail at noon sails at dusk. And at dusk, a canoe full of men paddles almost lazily across the mouth of a cove, trailing a line of brush that seems innocuous until it catches on a rudder. A curse rises. A knife appears. A second canoe glides in from the shade and releases a pot that breaks against a hull. Fire licks briefly along the pitch, then gutters where a bucket smashes it. Nothing terrible happens. Only smoke, confusion, shouts, the wasting of 10 minutes. 10 minutes here, then there. Lives measured not just in breaths, but in intervals. The lake answers timber with water, the coast answers timetables with interruption, and the city answers fear not with bravado, but with rules that keep men standing tomorrow. The divergence is not a miracle, not a victory carved out of thin legend. It is a series of human decisions arranged like stones across a stream. Some feet will still slide, some feet will still fall. Cuitlahuac's cough in the council chamber is a rumor of mortality. Not even leaders can stand outside the weather of disease. When he leans on the table during one session, the room feels colder for a breath. He speaks anyway, softer, the way a man speaks when he has made his throat into a bell. We do not need to win forever. We need to win until their letters run dry. He points to the map where Veracruz is marked as a square with a toothpick stuck in it. Someone's jest. He smiles without humor. That tooth will ache. Make it ache. Tlaxcala's messengers return with gifts that are not gifts, promises to keep raiders off roads that lead to our markets, assurances that their men will not follow Cortés into the lake if the lake becomes a graveyard for horses. Texcoco's pride bends into a calculation. Better a seat in a council than a place on a chain. Tlatelolco, forever our mirror and our rival, sends its own coil of rope to bind a span in place, as if to say, we will hold this together if you acknowledge how often we stood first row in your markets and last in your praise. The council drafts a new order for weights and measures, seals carved in cedar that will be hung at market entrances so that sellers and buyers can point to them when arguments heat. Petty, boring, decisive. On the fifth night, after the amnesty is announced, the drum sounds not from the temple, but from 4 points on the city's rim. That rhythm has been practiced, and now is lived. Gatehouse to gatehouse, post to post, the beat travels, and with every burst of sound, a small action occurs. A bridge half lifts and rests on a notch. A jar is moved from a shadow to a sill. A scout puts 2 fingers to his tongue and tastes the breeze. A boy closes his eyes and counts to 10 so that when he comes to 10, he can open them and see if the world has changed. It has, but not in a way that will sing in poems. The divergence sounds like wood rubbing wood, like ropes sliding through a hole, like the lake's lip against a stone. It is not glorious. It is function. Now the lake gleams differently at dusk. The brigantines' frames cast long, ribbed shadows that promise speed and menace. The city does not pretend those shadows are thin. It thickens its own. Canoes gather beneath the eaves of cypress, where light does not reach. Men grease their arms to move quieter. Firepots are passed hand to hand, wrapped in damp cloth, and prayers that have less to do with gods than with timing. The question shrinks to something a man can hold. Can we set 2 boats alight before the third realizes what has happened? If we cannot, can we ruin a sail? If we cannot, can we make a chain of floating brush that looks like nothing until it is something? Bending has not broken us. The next days will ask whether bending can break them. The year the strangers planted their tooth at Veracruz, the coast learned a new rhythm. Crates thudding, ropes squealing, prayers in a language that cut the air like salt. In 1519, the column moved inland with a confidence borrowed from horses. Steel flashed where obsidian would have sufficed, and banners glinted that no one here had sworn to. The hills watched. The valleys listened. Courts weighed the coin of old grievances and found it heavy. In markets that smelled of cacao and sweat, men traced the road to Cholula with fingers that had counted tribute too long. The memory of that city's festival turned to a furnace. Song, interrupted by slaughter, was a spark traveling quietly through dry thatch. The column met Tlaxcala and traded blood for alliance. That was the first wound the lake remembered, not ours, theirs. An adhesion formed from pain, a pact that would have held if the world were simpler. By the time they stepped onto the causeways for the first time, our city had already studied the shape of their shadows. They did not know it. They looked at stone that ran like streets into water and saw a marvel, not a maze. They looked at our paddles and heard a people without oars. They suffered from the confidence of straight lines. Cholula is not a story told here as apology. It is told as a hinge. When we speak the word, the air still tastes of ash. The men who carried that taste home to their lords became messengers without meaning to. Narrators in a theater none of us built. They made a coalition possible by proving what steel would do when asked to preach. That proof would follow Pedro de Alvarado into Tóxcatl, where drums became screams and sacred courtyards became drains. If you were there, you remember the way sunlight took on weight and how it pressed on your ribs as if daylight itself had turned to stone. If you were not, you still walk past walls that know the sound of metal hitting human bone. The first time the column met the lake as a plan rather than a view, it did what straight lines do. It marched. Columns are brave until the earth refuses to be flat. On La Noche Triste, June 1520, gold was the most honest soldier on their side. It pulled men down with impartial hands, catching in armor joints and saddlebags, making horses thrash water the color of moon. That night is a station in this story, not an ending. Our divergence began not with that sorrow, but with what followed. The gates that did not lift at random, the horn calls that did not overlap awkwardly, the paddlers who did not chase vengeance into torchlight, but counted to 10, and then to 10 again, before dipping their blades. Imagine the causeways that night, long black ribs laid over a lung of water. Our signals had been rehearsed until muscle forgot why mind had asked. The gate at Tlacopan rose a hand's breadth, then a man's, then a horse's height, then stopped as planned. The gap was not a hole, but an invitation. When the captain with a banner moved to test it, a canoe's shadow brushed the gap and then slid away as if shy. A second canoe touched an oar to the bridge's lip, and the oar made a sound like a bird's beak on wood. That was the cue. Firepots arced the way stars might if they were man-made. Low, deliberate throws that landed not on men but on planks. Pitch licked, boards blackened, and the hole widened to a mouth. Not all drowned, many escaped, but they escaped the way a man escapes a dream he cannot explain, running without understanding why his lungs remember water. When they reached the shore, they were smaller than the stories they would tell. The lake holds its knife under a cloak. Their straight lines learn to bend and dislike it. Memory becomes a weapon that does not dull with use. They limped toward Tlaxcala. Disease walked with them. Smallpox does not own banners or borders. It walks where breath walks. It came to us, too, and no law could tuck it back into its invisible sheath. We slowed it by teaching distance. The market rows widened, the temple steps cleared. The boats that once kissed gunwales now kept a spear's length between them. Cuitlawac's strength faltered. When he coughed, the council leaned closer to hear the rest. A leader's body is a map of a city's fear. He did not pretend to be stone. He turned suffering into instruction. He named a war council that could move without waiting for one man's breath. He placed Cuauhtémoc where decisions needed young wrists. By the time the strangers' carpenters began to raise the frames of their lake boats in 1521, our doctrine had become marrow. This is what it said: do not win by spectacle, win by removing the need for spectacle. Sabotage began at the scale of a splinter, a wedge miscut, a nail softened in a brazier and bent, a canvas tar darkened with oil that turned it into a reluctant lung. Men with wet hands and patient faces visited the yards at dusk and left them almost the same as they had been, but not quite. And on the water, a second plan, to erase channels not with walls, but with refuse disguised as nature. Reeds, brush, submerged fences, trifles when seen, trials when struck. They launched brigantines anyway, a ribbed procession geometering across the lake, shallow draft, square sails, oars biting where wind sulked. The first day they circled with the pride of things newly named. Crossbows hummed, arquebuses barked, smoke made brief clouds that the lake ignored. Canoes drifted at the edges, and then did not. When a brigantine chose to cut inside a stand of reeds where a canoe had just been, its keel found what reeds had hidden. A shiver ran through oak and men. Oars reversed. Men cursed. A crossbowman swore he saw the water move against the wind. He was right, but not the way he imagined. Night was our light. Canoes came in pairs, one with fire, one with water. The first nosed softly until its bow kissed oak. Clay broke. Pitch found pitch. Tongues of flame learned a new wood. The second canoe slid bow to bow and poured skins across sparks until a hiss wrote itself into the air like a denial. A third canoe slipped a weighted rope over a stern and hauled brush into a rudder's crook. The brigantine did not burn grandly. It stuttered. It shouted for help and received it, and every help took minutes. Minutes had become our currency. We spent them without greed. In daylight, the brigantines did damage. Canoes with men too brave or new to the doctrine died in patterns that our teachers read aloud to correct. We learned not to chase into open water, not to let a bright thought pull us into a straight line. We learned to bring small shields carved from captured planks and to fix Spanish bucklers to our forearms when we took them. We learned that steel is a good thing to wear and a poor thing to carry far. It bruises shoulders. It drowns men eager to keep it. We learned that crossbows hate mist as much as arquebuses hate rain. When clouds built over the lake and refused to commit to storm, we smiled anyway. Indecision in the sky is still moisture on a bowstring. Their boats exist, but their confidence leaks. Ours are only canoes, yet the lake prefers them. Time's edge cuts meat off iron. The coast spoke the same language. Bands of scouts moved like punctuation along sentences of beach. We did not barricade the sea. We embarrassed it. When a ship anchored and men shouted in a half-circle of surf, a pile of crates would go missing before it was inventoried. When they marched a barrel to the dry sand, someone's knife had earlier loosened a stave so that the barrel sighed itself useless over an afternoon. When a new camp pitched beyond the dune, a watcher sniffed the air at dusk and chose the one patch that would be a puddle by morning. We let them work. We let them believe they were working. A storm did not save us. Weather is not a sword you ask to leap from the scabbard, but rain fell when it often falls, and we were ready to ask it questions. A cache we had already marked spoiled itself with a night's humility. A crate already missing its nails came apart under a tired hand. Delay compounded the interest of frustration. A letter meant to reach a commander waiting to move inland reached him a day later, by which time a path across marsh had become a ribbon of glue. Up the causeways, their cavalry tried to make narrowness widen with speed. Horses hate uncertainty. They do not fear gods, but they despise hollow ground. Where planks had been moved and holes disguised as continuity lay waiting, we did not have to be many. We only had to be close when hooves found air. A horse going down makes a sound that rattles teeth. Men behind it must choose, pile in and learn that gravity is more stubborn than will, or turn and reveal to the rear that turning is a choice they also have. We made that choice feel like wisdom rather than fear by shaping the room with traps that made pride a kind of stupidity. Across the lake, Texcoco watched us with the face of a cousin who knows your worst stories. Pride is flint. It throws sparks when struck. We gave it a whetstone instead. Market protections took teeth out of old insults. A bench in council with a cushion that did not look borrowed. A public weighing stone that lived under their portico. Not ours. These are small things that loosen big knots. Tlaxcala sent men, but not as a flood. They came in bands whose captains wore expressions like men testing soup. Hot, yes, but can it be swallowed? They did not run when we set reed fences shallow. Some learned to cut, some learned to avoid. Some learned to write letters to superiors saying that cutting and avoiding were both harder than they looked. Inside the city, Chapultepec's aqueducts earned their guards. When the invaders' allies lunged at them, they found watchers who had been trained to hear leather on stone. We had built reservoirs not to brag, but to make palaces into cisterns. Water rationing was not a slogan. It was a chalk mark on doorposts and a woman's hand stopping a ladle's descent after one scoop. The markets breathed at a measured tempo. Less crowd, more space. Hunger did not invade. It circulated, trimmed by granaries that had been filled an extra day each week for months. Priests stood in line for grain like other men. That was not theater. It was a rule. There were fights we did not win. Men died on the lake whose names deserved to outlive this telling. A brigantine cut a path one morning that looked like a scar at noon. A long curve through reeds and traps because the captain aboard it had counted our signals, learned a cadence, and chose to interrupt it. He drove hard. The oars beat time. Crossbows found arcs that our shields could not all catch. We withdrew with losses that made the evening chant taste like iron. That night, we changed the cadence. Habit is a kind of arrogance, too. Adaptation overtakes improvisation. Our rules become theirs to fear. Victory is measured in intervals, not in songs. When the siege tightened, because it tightened even in this telling, we did not pretend we were immune to circles. A city starves in rings. The first ring is fear, the second is water, the third is grain. We fought on all three. Fear, we answered by ritual without exhibition, processions that moved slowly and touched nothing, prayers spoken in open courtyards where wind could carry words apart like seeds. Water we answered by using boats as buckets, canals as ropes. Grain we answered by the arithmetic of patience. Fewer feasts, more soups, waits that made cheats ashamed, guards who treated theft without cruelty, but without pause. Cuauhtémoc walked the market rows with sand on his sandals and looked at scales the way a judge looks at knives. Cortés was not a man who conceded to time. He pressed. He tried to cut the aqueducts again and again, and sometimes he did. He sent boats where we had not placed fences, and sometimes found holes in our holes. He rallied allies with promises that were not cheap. He wrote letters in a hand that has taught historians too much and his soldiers too little. He bled at least once with a clarity that made him understand he was not legend yet. He survived because talent does not vanish when plans do. We did not defeat a fool. We defeated a man with more will than food. The night the coalition cracked began without clairvoyance. On the eastern causeway, a parley was called by a smaller lord from the hills who had brought 200 men to the siege and had lost 40 to illness and 20 to water and had counted each. He asked for food for the men he had left. Cortés offered him promises. We offered him sacks. They were small sacks. They were carried by pochteca boys whose wrists trembled because the sacks were heavier than their arms were used to. They went out under our seal and came back having been allowed through 2 checkpoints, where only weeks before knives would have frisked them of their lives. The Lord sat in his camp and ate, and then wrote a letter not to us but to no one, because he was a man who needed to admit to paper that equations change. The next morning his 200 were 150, not because men had died, but because men had walked home. The brigantines, fewer now because wood burns and oars break and oak does not heal, tried one last wide sweep along the city's north. We let them. We marked their path with 3 sets of reeds that were nothing but reeds until the 3rd set hit a rope. When the first boat plowed through, its prow kissed the rope kissed back, and the boat slowed with the affronted dignity of a proud animal that has stepped in mud. The second boat tried to swing wide and found that we had learned its habit of swinging wide. The third hung back and did the wisest thing it could. It waited. Waiting was almost a victory. Our canoes kept their distance, and then, without any shout to sharpen the air, moved. Fire kissed tar. Water kissed fire. The boats lived. Some did. Some did not. The lake kept what it wanted. The coalition eats its own patience. Our confederation chews slowly, but swallows. Iron rusts at human speed. Retreat looks different when a man has to invent it for himself. Cortés did not call it that. He pivoted. He declared a movement to a stronger position. He chose a road that would take him out of the lake's grammar and into the language of hills where he had found more consonants. He left behind fewer boats than he had counted and more ghosts than he would admit. He did not know that along the coast the caches were shy, the ropes brittle, the letters damp. He did not know how many lords would choose benches over banners when they had to decide between taxes and funerals. He went because going was the version of staying he could tolerate. We did not chase. That is the victory you cannot shout without ruining it. We held the causeways and counted the boards. We lowered bridges and lifted them again until the pins slid like habit. We cleaned the markets and barred the temple doors against spectacle masquerading as faith. We sent boats to clear out the fences and then built them again farther north because the lake's memory should never be allowed to sleep. We buried men at dawn and let their families stand long enough that grief became public and then private again in proper measure. We drafted a seal for weights that looked like a water bird because everyone had seen one and no one argued about its shape. By summer's fall, the city was thinner and harder and quieter. The council was larger than it had been because power, to survive, had learned how to sit next to itself without flinching. The pochteca carried messages that combined prices and policies into one breath. The aqueducts had new guards who did not look brave because bravery had been retired in favor of schedule. The lake flashed with paddles that were less frantic than before, the way a body heals after fever. Sweat gone, pulse slower, appetite back but not greedy. The invaders were not all gone. A few stayed in towns that preferred their coin to our seals. A few roamed the hills with broken saddles and unbroken pride. Ships still appeared on the horizon with the indifference of tides, but our shoreline no longer behaved like a welcome. It behaved like an answer. We have defeated the expedition without declaring war on the ocean. We have kept the city breathing without teaching it to shout. We have traded a single story of conquest for 1,000 small stories of endurance. The lake will remember the night we did not pursue. It will hold the echo of oars that could have splashed and did not. That restraint will taste like ash to some and like wisdom to others. In that silence lies the blueprint for what must come next. The work of making a victory into a structure into a habit into a peace that, while not grand, outlasts noise. Morning opens the city like a book. Pages of water between lines of stone. Markets unfold, bridges drop, and paddles begin their low writing on the lake. Victory is a brittle word. It snaps if you lean weight on the wrong letter. What follows must be a scaffolding of smaller words. Measure, seal, quota, oath, bench. The hall fills with them. The council chamber is no longer a single circle. It is a ring that has learned to grow. Benches have been added, wider than custom, lower than pride. On them sit men from Tlaxcala with winter in their hair. Envoys from Texcoco who wear grievance like an ornament because it reminds others to be careful. A woman from Tlatelolco whose voice can count to the last grain in a stall without raising. Quidlawak presides in a cloak that has seen rain. Quotamoc watches the room rather than the door. On a mat between them lies a smooth stone. When a man speaks, he touches it. When a woman speaks, she turns it. The stone keeps the room in one time. The first decree does not lift a sword. It sets a scale. Weights and measures will live under porticos in every market we seal, carved in cedar and stone, marked with a water bird whose beak points toward trade. A seller may bring his baskets against these shapes. A buyer may do the same. Toll tables are posted with marks that even the half-literate can follow. How much for salt? How much for cloth? How much less when roads are unsafe and we cannot protect them? The law does not care where you are from if you carry our token. The token is small, a slice of bone smoothed by hands that count for a living. The pochteca wear it on cords they can tuck into their tunics. Its shape is not a god. It is an assurance. At dawn, Xocoyotzin, the merchant who can smell false weights through walls, ties his token at his neck and leads a caravan out of the city. Canoes carry baskets piled with cacao and obsidian blades bundled tight against chipping. On the far bank, a road waits that has teeth where it used to have thieves. At the first outpost, a guard holds the token up to the light, nods, and calls to a boy who brings a seal carved on a stick. The boy presses that seal into the rim of one basket, and the wax cools fast in morning air. The boy grins. The merchant does not. He has work. The benches have multiplied. The market has learned a new habit, and law has breathed into objects small enough to fit in a hand. Confederation is the word that no one says because it is from a world we do not know. We call it a council with long arms. Tribute becomes a lens we can adjust instead of a hammer that only strikes. Quotas shrink when fields drown and expand when roads are safe. Cloth can pay what once only copper could. Bread can settle what once only blood did. In the new order, a lord from a hill town hoards less because hoarding is visible in the weight of his sacks and the sound of his stalls. He sits on a bench under a painted serpent and complains about the tax on salt. The woman from Tlatelolco asks him, without softness, whether he brought 10 sacks when the law asked for 8 last season. He nods because he did. The serpent watches without language. The law learns to stand without drama. At the lake's edge, the second layer of survival drills its alphabet. Gatehouses are built like short poems, efficient syllables of wood and stone. Signal boards lean ready. Oil jars sit near, but not too close to torch brackets. A horn lies on a mat, its mouth greased so lips do not stick in cold. The men who sleep here have been taught to wake quickly, but not loudly. On the wall hangs a board painted with a simple grid. A torch held high, bridge up. A torch held low, bridge down. A torch moving left to right. Enemy boats within sight. A torch moving right to left. Ours. The doctrine is not secret. It is public, so that confusion has fewer places to hide. The lake patrol is a living string stretched along water. Canoes pair up, one heavy, one light, one meant to ram, one to fetch. Oars are cut narrower to quiet their bite. Leather strips are tied to the rims to catch on the edge of a rudder or cling to a hull. Each crew trains in darkness until the muscles of their backs can tell what time it is. When they exercise, the teacher calls numbers as if reciting a prayer. 3 strokes, turn. 5 strokes, halt. Hold your breath for the length of a lit reed. Men learn to grin without showing teeth because teeth catch torchlight. Beyond the reeds, the coast trains in a language only weather speaks, and it answers with fires. Early warning bands watch the horizon and practice their own signals. 2 beacons at once for ships, a single long column for land raiders. Hills receive those signals and duplicate them, lighting the next ridge so the city can see far without moving. Scouts rotate by season, learning which inlet silts shut after storms and which remains treacherously open. When a strange camp appears, scouts do not test it with bravery. They count water jars. They watch the way smoke lifts. They note whether men keep their tents tight or careless. The next morning, the camp's ropes have been chewed by rats that know neither God nor flag, and the stakes withdraw from sand with the humility of things that were not meant to stay. Water has eyes day and night. Stone listens with gates that learn to breathe, and the coastline has become a string of throats that can shout without a single voice breaking. Public health becomes a craft. The doctor with the cool hands does not pretend to be a savior. He is a counter of distances. Markets add an extra lane between stalls during fever months. Waits are not only for flour, they are for time. How long to boil? How many minutes between ladles? How many songs to hum before moving to the next house? Boats that once bumped as greeting now clip reeds and announce before passing. 2 small islands at the lake's edge, once ceremonial, rarely used, become places where the sick can lie with wind and water close. Priests walk there with herbs and prayers that cost the gods less blood and the people less grief. Wives braid their hair with red thread during outbreak weeks so that men remember not to kiss them on the mouth. The city measures its breath and keeps it. The third layer of safety is less visible and more stubborn. Belief without theater. The high platform still sees flowers, incense, song. It does not see captives torn before the crowd. Sacrifice does not vanish. It turns inward, becomes a private blade drawn across a warrior's ear, a drop on a statue's toe, a thin line of red on a dark altar that drinks it the way a rock drinks dew. Priests learn new chants whose verbs are give and keep, not take and display. An old man at a household shrine teaches his granddaughter to press maize dough into the shape of a heart and to break it in 2 with a thumb. The gods are not offended. They accept substitutions the way a parent accepts a child's drawing for a lost flower. In council, a Texcoco envoy watches a procession that ends without the old clamor and exhales. We can stand beside this, he says, not to be kind, but because his bench depends on it. Trade under leash is another art. We do not pretend the sea will forget us. We do not invite it in blind. 2 ports are marked with our seal and our law. One near the marsh, where mangroves make a lace on water. Another on a plain of dunes that shift but can be coaxed into roads. No garrisons allowed, no churches built, no letters read aloud in our markets without our seal pressed on the wax. When foreign ships anchor, they do it where pilings have been sunk under our eyes. Goods are inspected piece by piece. No barrels of fire powder into the lagoon. No stacks of timber high enough to become a militia. Men leave hostages without calling them that. Sons of minor lords come to our city to learn language, weights, law. Our sons go to theirs to learn wind and rope, and a map that contradicts our own. They dine well and walk heavily guarded streets. These are honor exchanges that smell faintly of prison and strongly of peace. Faith has turned its blade inward. Trade breathes through 2 controlled mouths, and the sea is a guest who checks his shoes. The pochteca ascend. Merchants become messengers with better memories than scribes. They carry not just prices, but policies. They bring back rumors that are more useful than boasts. A lord in the west who cheats weights. A narrow road where thieves claim to wear our seal. The council answers not with flares of rage, but with auditors bearing bags of seed, and stories of how men who cheat are taught to be ashamed. A man's stall is shut for a day, then 2, then 5. His mother comes to plead because shame sits badly on a family. He stops cheating not because he fears a blade, but because he fears never again pressing his thumb against the market's weighing stone without people watching. The market is the city's heart. It must beat evenly. On a hot afternoon, Xocoyotzin returns from a ride that has taught him the names of 5 new streams and the angles of 2 new shadows. In the plaza, he stops before the weighing stone. A crowd gathers because people like to watch fairness more than they admit. He lifts a basket of cacao and pours it into a measuring gourd. A boy counts. A woman says that last week the gourd swallowed more. Xocoyotzin nods and fetches the cedar weight. He balances gourd against weight until they agree. He smiles and raises the boy's hand. Applause is soft but sincere. In the crowd, a Texcoco envoy watches and sends a message that simply says, "We will send 3 more caravans this month." Security breathes through drills. The lake patrol practices under a moon that longs to be seen. Firepots are handled like children and carried like funerals. A team of paddlers trains to launch from sleep to stroke in one verse of a chant. At the gatehouses, men rehearse raising a bridge in the dark until they can do it with fingers and feet and breath alone. On the coast, signal beacons are tested with damp wood so men can learn to coax flame even from reluctance. Scouts practice vanishing in grass until a horse could step over them and never know. The law learns to travel. Tribunal mats are carried to towns that have never seen our judges, and the judges sit without scowls, with ears better than their tongues. A case is heard where a man claims a guard took grain from his sack. The guard is summoned, his captain too. The pochteca who vouches for the man places his token on the mate. The judge weighs words and then grain. The penalty is paid in public, double the missing weight, plus a day's service at the market gate. The guard's captain bows, not broken, but adjusted. The town watches and decides that our seal is not merely a threat. It is a promise. Drills have become bedtime stories. Law has left the palace and learned the names of roads, and men carry fairness the way they carry water, everywhere. In a courtyard late in the day, Cuauhtémoc kneels beside a woman who is teaching her son a new prayer. He does not interrupt. He listens to the words, which are ordinary and therefore strong. When she finishes, he asks her what she thinks of the city now. She looks at him as if the question is a strange fruit. "It breathes," she says. "It breathes without panting." He nods. The boy stares at the scar on Cuauhtémoc's wrist and asks if it hurts. "Only when I pretend I am made of stone," the young lord says. The boy laughs. He will remember that line better than any decree. In the council that evening, an envoy from a coastal town brings a concern that tastes of salt. A ship anchored beyond our beacon line and tried to trade by canoe, ignoring the terms. Our men did not fight. They watched. The envoy wishes for a show of force. Cuitlahuac rubs his throat and speaks quietly. "If we fight on the sea's terms, we teach it what pleases it most. We will instead make the shore narrower." He calls for more pilings sunk under our seal, for more marsh paths mapped and more sand shaped into shallow channels that punish deep keels. "Let them wait for our permit, because there is nowhere else to go." The envoy frowns, then nods when he imagines a ship's captain angry at idle men and stale water. Strategy is sometimes boredom dressed as patience. At the edge of the lake, under cypress that have heard more secrets than priests, 2 young nobles exchange bracelets. One is ours. One is from a hill town that has learned to sit on our benches. They are cousins now in the way politics calls cousin. They will be sent to each other's houses for seasons of learning, their lives heavy with the knowledge that peace sometimes wears your face. They look nervous and handsome and slightly ill. It is not romance. It is a rope across a river. Men will cross behind them because it exists. The city thickens its habits. Granaries are checked by women whose tongues are sharper than their knives and who can glance at a stack of maize and know whether a tenth is missing. Aqueduct guards inherit whistles shaped like birds, whose notes carry better than shouts. At the market, a new stall opens that sells nothing but jars with tight lids and lids with tight meanings. Household safety as commerce. In temples, priests polish mirrors of obsidian that show the faces of supplicants clearly, so that a man sees himself when he asks for intercession. Reflection becomes a ritual. Our benches are full. Our roads are counted. Our gods have accepted the exchange rate of blood for breath. and the sea learns to knock. At dusk, the lake returns to ink. Paddles sound like commas. A watchman on the southern causeway draws his cloak closer. He knows the drills, the signals, the weight of the bridge pin, the whistle notes for hurry and wait. He also knows the names of the men who sit on foreign benches in our hall, the merchant who once cheated and now counts out loud, the doctor who smells of herbs and smoke, the boy who asked if scars hurt. He knows this because the city has learned to name more than enemies. It names responsibilities the way a fisherman names currents. He looks toward the north, where the brigantines once cut arrogant lines. The water is empty tonight, except for small lights, where fishermen lift nets and put them down again. He rests his hand on the bridge pin, feels the cold of metal, and smiles because the weight is familiar. Behind him, in the far hall, words are being weighed. Ahead of him, the lake measures wind on its own scale. Between the two, the city keeps to the rhythm it has taught itself. Not the beat of triumph, but the steady count that keeps men from rushing and keeps hunger from speaking too loudly. Victory was an accident if it ends here. It becomes a design when the night passes uneventfully, and then the next night and the next, until uneventfulness itself is the most remarkable thing. The years after the lake learned to fight were quieter than the songs that could have been written about them. And that is the point. The 1520s open like the palm of a careful hand, lines old, calluses new. On market days, the plaza hums as if bees had discovered a square of stone. Children grow under rules that were once plans and are now furniture. Men paddle with fewer glances over their shoulders. Women count grain by habit more than dread. The wounds of siege have not vanished. They have knit. Scar tissue itches when it rains, but it holds. Far off, out where the sea writes its own laws, word of a conquest refused moves through ports the way gossip moves through kitchens. Letters that once promised an empire now fold themselves into smaller ambitions, a punitive expedition rather than a crown. Ships still come, less certain, more wary. Some fly the same flag, a few fly others. They are not met with spears or with welcomes. They are met with rules. At the southern designated anchorage, the pilings sit like the ribs of some giant fish that learned to stand upright. Foreign boats tie to them, or they do not tie at all. Men step ashore and find their feet made of forms, tokens, seals, ledgers that smell of cedar and authority. Goods are inspected with a patience that sometimes resembles contempt. Barrels are tapped, bales opened. The powder that would slip inland finds itself counted, and then counted again, until its carriers forget why they cared. Probes arrive with teeth dulled by paperwork. The sea learns that our shore does not believe in miracles of convenience. A trickle becomes a river only if you let it, and we do not. Iron knives appear in markets, rare, whispered over, traded for more cacao than they are worth to a man who thinks in days rather than years. Obsidian does not retire. It sits beside iron and refuses obsolescence because it is sharp enough for the work most lives do. A handful of crossbow bolts, sleek as fish, trade hands, and then are hung in shrines like warnings disguised as trophies. Horses appear now and then in parades, swaggering creatures who make children point, and dogs reconsider their gods. They do not multiply wildly. A field of reeds is no pasture. A city of canals teaches hooves humility. When a boy asks his mother whether they will all ride one day, she laughs and tells him to watch a man try to turn a horse on a causeway without daylight to spare. The disease that first came in the breath of strangers does not vanish with them. It remembers the way to our doors. It returns in pulses, meaner some years than others, and the city practices what it learned: spacing, boiling, islands given over to wind and quiet. The priest who once would have demanded the heart of a captive now demands that a market row be widened by the span of 2 palms. The doctor's voice becomes familiar enough to be ignored until a neighbor reminds you he was right last time. The drum that called men to war now sometimes calls them to leave the plaza, to lower their masks of indifference and admit that breath is a shared wealth. In the council hall, benches have ruts worn by the years. Tlaxcala's elders sit straighter. Texcoco practices the art of noble complaint without noble sabotage. Tlatelolco rises early to open the northern market and reminds everyone of this at every opportunity. Tribute shifts with harvests and road safety. A lord who sent maize last season sends cloth this one and writes to explain why. The letter is read aloud, folded neatly, filed. The pochteca return from trips that would have been raids in other ages with notebooks in their heads and prices on their tongues. They speak of towns where waits have become prayers, and of a valley whose new magistrate shuts down the wine stall at dusk because fights after dark cost more than they sell. The Confederation has learned how to be boring on purpose, and boredom keeps men fed. From the hills northeast come rumors of silver far beyond maps we care about. From the west, stories of men in mail shirts pushing through thorn and dust with priests at their elbows. We hear these things because traders sleep in places where gossip is currency. Our answer is not cavalry. Our answer is to make the roads to us visible and the roads through us confusing. A town that tries to pull caravans away with lower tolls finds itself ignored at 2 markets instead of rewarded at 1. A lord who refuses to send men to the coastal watch loses his bench for a season and wins it back by standing in the rain with a whistle until his beard drips. The penalties are shaped like behaviors. They teach as much as they punish. In the 1530s, a Spanish captain returns with boats that remember our fences and men who remember their last swim. He has studied the lake and believes he has found the angles we prefer. He is right about the angles and wrong about the time. The patrols have changed their cadence each season as instructed. The watchers who learn to count strokes have taught their sons a new count. The brigantines that try to sweep are met not at the reeds, but in open water, briefly, to suggest a path. And then the path becomes foam because the wind has shifted, and because we loosened a line we tightened last year. The captain retreats with the face of a man who does not know whether the lake is an enemy or a teacher with a lesson he despises. A quieter threat arrives with ink. A friar slips into a coastal camp with a smile and a cross and a trunk of books. He speaks Nahuatl more gently than some of our own lords because he has made it a map to our minds. He asks to build a small house for prayer near the anchorage. Only for sailors, he says, only to keep them good. He is refused with courtesy and a story about storms. This is a marsh, the envoy says. Houses here sink unless the gods hold them up, and ours are tired. The friar writes a letter that smells of regret and salt. The letter travels. It returns an answer that flares with authority. The answer's turned into a docket and then into a rule about how far from the piling a tent may be pitched. The friar packs. The cross remains in a chest. Small victories are the ones that last. Ships come and go without planting their shadows. Ink dries on paper instead of on our doorposts. The city itself changes in ways too slow to sing. New neighborhoods mark their corners with painted stones that show a water bird with a beak pointed toward trade. A school opens in a courtyard where boys from 3 towns learn to read prices and to speak the words that keep benches talking. They practice speeches about tolls and watch the way a judge's fingers play with the weighing stone. Girls learn to bind ledgers and to teach their brothers how not to cheat without making enemies. A room beside the temple stores jars with lids so tight that the children can't open them and laugh. Their mothers can and don't. On festival days, the streets still smell of copal and roasted maize. Music carries across the canals and turns corners as if it were water. The great platform gleams. Men climb it and bleed from ears and tongues and offer that smallest of coins to the oldest of banks. The crowd exhales, relieved and a little awed. In a side square, a troupe performs a story about a lake that taught a city to breathe less loudly. The applause is a tide, neither roaring nor shallow. People go home with the kind of satisfaction that keeps them from throwing stones at their neighbors. Not everything is ease. There are years when the maize does not rise high enough, and years when the rivers do. There are moments when a lord declares himself taller than his bench, and learns that benches can be cut lower. There are nights when a patrol boat does not return, and the morning's count shrinks by names that mattered. There is a winter when smallpox takes a priest who held together a street by the force of his remembering every child's face. Grief does not ask permission. It comes like weather. The city answers with the same liturgy it uses for everything else now. Routine, respect, adjustment. A new priest learns the names. The patrol's cousin takes the oar. The Lord sits, rubs the place where his bench used to be higher, and learns to listen with the muscle that once used to shout. By the 1540s, the world around us has rearranged itself to accommodate our refusal. Not in awe, nobody admires a city for choosing tedium over glory, but in practice. Caravans from the south time their arrivals to our market days because off days are dull and full of rules. Fishermen sell nets with weights tied just so. A bad net is a rumor that empties a stall. The aqueduct guards have a song they sing on rounds that children parody, and that parody is how they learn the stanzas. Along the coast, a chain of watchfires can light in an hour what once took a day. Pirates appear twice and discover that boredom can also be a trap. No taverns, no buyers, no campfires to slip among with a blade. They leave with hunger. Our future is not a cliff, but a slope. We do not climb quickly. We do not fall. What we have built has costs that no chant can hide. Vigilance never sleeps. It only naps. The men at the gatehouses grow old with shoulders shaped by pins. The pochteca walk with knees that ache when the rains come, burdened not with sacks, but with the memory of people's prices and tempers. A boy looks at a brigantine burning in a painting and asks his father why we did not burn them all. Because we wanted to sleep, his father says. Because fire is a habit if you let it be. The boy nods and does not understand yet that habits are wars fought slowly. But there is a kind of beauty reserved for those who choose to survive without spectacle. It lives in mornings that begin on time and evenings that end with the sound of a door sliding into its frame. It lives in a market where a man and a woman can argue about beans as if beans were the only war under the sun. It lives in a temple that smells of incense and bread, but not of panic. It lives in a lake that reflects lamps rather than flames. On a night like the ones the story began with, a watchman stands on the southern causeway. He rests his palm on the bridge pin and then lifts his hand to his mouth to warm it. The water is black, thick as the stone underfoot, and the stars lie on it like coins. Far away, a ship passes the anchorage without turning in. Closer, two canoes slide along the reeds with the confidence of men who know every eel's hiding place. From the city comes the sound of a drum, low and unhurried. It is not an alarm. It is a count to mark the changing of the patrols, the closing of the market, the hour when candles may be snuffed and stories told. He thinks of names that have become edges of the map in his head. Veracruz, a tooth gone dull. Tlaxcala, a voice that now clears its throat before shouting. Texcoco, a mirror that reflects more patience than pride. He thinks of Cuitlahuac, who taught the city to eat survival with its pride and did not live to see the harvest. Of Cuauhtémoc, whose scars pared words down to tools. Of Malintzin, who built bridges without becoming a road. He thinks of the doctor's hands and the priest's new chants. Of Xocoyotzin's bone token, smooth now as a river pebble, kissed by thousands of thumbs. So far, this life has been made of intervals. The next will be too. The lake is a clock with numbers the sky can read. The city keeps time with it. The watchman looks down and sees himself in the black water, smaller than the lamps and larger than his fear. He hears a child laugh from a boat, and a woman shush that laugh and then laugh herself. He hears a vendor tally the day's coins and a teacher tell a story about a horse that tried to turn on a causeway and learned humility in one breath. He hears his own breath mix with the lake's. He lifts the pin an inch and lowers it again, not because danger approaches, but because the gesture has become part of the way the bridge remembers how to behave. If you tilt your head, you can imagine another ending. You can picture a plaza burning, a temple top slick with conquest, a language swallowed whole and burped out in someone else's grammar. You can imagine a city leveled into an altar for an empire foreign to its own sky. That picture is easy. It fits in one painting and sells in ports. This one does not. It is harder to carry because it is heavy with details, seals and weights, benches and beacons, ropes and drills, reeds and rules. It is not the story of a people who learn to conquer the world. It is the story of a people who learn to stop their own blood from running out. It is not smaller. It is closer to the size of a human life. The drum speaks one last time and then falls silent. The watchman breathes. The lake breathes with him. The city, which has learned to bend without breaking, sleeps under its own guardianship. If you have followed this far, if you have felt the weight of small choices stack into a wall, if you can taste the difference between a spectacle and a survival, then stay. There are other lakes, other maps, other nights when decisions looked like reeds in the dark and turned out to be bridges. Light a lamp with us. Subscribe to What If Wars. Come back to the shore where history leans and asks what might have been, and what with care still might be.